La segunda ponente de hoy es Tereza Pavlickova, profesora en la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Charles University en Praga. Su investigación se centra en las audiencias de los medios de comunicación y en la interpretación y usos que esta audiencia hace de los medios. Hoy nos hablará sobre la percepción que tienen las audiencias de los mismos autores. So, now it's your turn.
So, hello everybody, buenos días a todos. I would like to kind of continue on the same line as Mark said. Thank you for inviting me and being really great hosts. And we had an amazing day yesterday despite all of the rain. And I'm really honored to be part of this conference and to be kind of invited to contribute to this debate about the relationship between the audiences, active audiences and journalism, which is my main research interest, but I might be maybe a little bit, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too highly about myself, but maybe a little bit too exotic for you because the perspective I'm coming from is not the perspective of journalism and the production, but it really is kind of the perspective of the audiences and the audience research. So I'm kind of really trained and deep breath in the classical kind of audience research tradition, and that's where I'm coming from, and that's what I would like to make this paper about, is to kind of outline and also put into some kind of interaction the various concepts, how audiences and journalists or producers are being conceptualized and talked about. So if we ask ourselves who are the active audiences and how they are being approached by media studies, we have two concepts, audiences and producers, and we can ask questions, what is the mutual relationships between them and what is their role in the process of reception and production. And this kind of gives us really massive field of how we can approach and conceptualize these topics. And traditionally, or kind of what's been audience research, so it's kind of really warm here, Mark was warning me, but I kind of didn't believe him. Traditionally, audiences were conceptualized or approached in what we could call audiences against the producers. And I don't know how much you are familiar with the reception and like the active reception research, where the audience's activity is understood as a reception and interpretation, basically the process of a reader encountering a text and making meaning. And originally, or this tradition has coming from Great Britain, and it's really closely linked to culture studies tradition, and it basically is mainly preoccupied, or primarily it was preoccupied with the power and resistance of the audiences over the meaning. And the most famous people coming from this tradition are probably David Morley with his work National-Wide Audiences, and then Family Television, or Ian Ang with her Watching Dallas, for example, or Radway talking about the reading romance. And later, like this tradition kind of started in the 70s. You probably all heard about Stuart Hall and his kind of really short and probably originally about something a little bit different topic paper, but that became really well known for his theory of encoding, decoding, where he's basically distinguishing three types of decoding on the side of the audiences, which is the message that people can encode from the decode from the text can be hegemonic or dominant, which means you basically accept the message that is being kind of encoded into the text. The middle position is negotiated, where there is some sort of negotiation between the reader's position and the kind of author's position, and then oppositional, where you can sort of resist and oppose and kind of make your own meaning. But this kind of, I should also clarify a little bit, this active audiences and this sort of conceptualization of interpretation should never ever be understood in this sort of any meaning or kind of any random meaning and some sort of looking for individual personal psychologies of the members of the audiences. What is really crucial for these theories is that the meaning is kind of negotiated between the text and the audiences, and it's kind of the moment where they meet, and the very important kind of notion is the notion of the context, that like the texts are polysemic, they have multiple kind of meanings, they kind of suggest various readings. Stuart Hall talks about preferred meaning, which is kind of the one that the author obviously tries to promote the most by the structure and composition of the text. But obviously there are certain kind of spaces where you as a reader, as an audience enters in, and you are bringing your own context, your cultural, social and historical kind of position where you're coming from, and that's where you kind of, that's where the meaning is being made. So in this kind of concept of the relationship between audiences and producers, the meaning, as I kind of suggested, is the result of the text and reader encounter, and suddenly the producer, the author, is being redundant, and he's kind of neglected, he's kind of forgotten, and as I will kind of show you a little bit later, or as my kind of title already suggested, the author's kind of dead, like he's not, we don't care about him, because when you are in the process of interpretation, the author's not there, you can't ask any subsequent additional questions. The only thing you have is the text, and you have to work with that. And then you probably kind of already have the notion that there is a little bit of a move, and that's what kind of. Oh, sorry. Oh, this is very important other thing. I completely forgot because I thought I already mentioned. There is also audience against producers, kind of very strong tradition within a literary theory. And these people are coming different, like from different kind of philosophical background. They are not so kind of preoccupied by the question of power and resistance. What's really interesting for them is that they never work with empirical reader. And their concept is really, really theoretical, but they are building strongly on philosophical, like one particular philosophy of Hans-Georg Gadamer, who is a German philosopher, kind of like a Heidegger student, and they are the school is called a Constant School of Reception Aesthetics, and the main authors are Wolfgang Iser and Robert Jauss, and they basically kind of empowering the reader within the literary theory, and they kind of talking about that the author shouldn't be some guide to the intention. We shouldn't be seeking in interpretation what the author meant, what the author wanted to say, but the meaning is once again in this sense they are kind of their conclusion is very similar to the media studies kind of school. The meaning is result of the negotiation between the reader and the text. And so now I will get to my kind of other point, and that's that like we can start to see this shift in the recent media, in the recent audience research to debates about audiences are producers, and suddenly it's the production and distribution that are seen as a form of activities. You might have heard about Axel Burns that introduced the term producer as instead of the C there's S, like user as a producer. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it to make it clear, but that basically is suddenly conceptualizing audience's activity as a form of production, and probably the thing that is more topic of this conference, this kind of understanding that if we don't produce, we are not active, and if we don't produce, we kind of don't really make meaning, and suddenly we can I see this approach as I don't argue with the fact that people do kind of produce more media content or more visibly. I somehow feel sometimes there is a problem with the conceptualization because we tend to give the power to the technology. We suddenly feel that the audiences are empowered thanks to the technology rather than just the basic intellectual ability, the capacity to interpret and to kind of create or make a meaning out of the text. So just to sum it up, we're talking about activity as a reception and interpretation versus activity as a production and distribution. And while the first one is neglecting and making the authors and producers redundant, the other one is kind of over-celebrating them, kind of stressing their role, and this kind of this shift in the conceptualization, I kind of feel sometimes paradoxically is killing the audiences, because suddenly we all are becoming authors, but then who is the reader? And we kind of researching audiences in a context of production. We don't research them, or we are not interested in them anymore in the context of how do they make meaning, what do they with the text, how do they understand them, and so I will kind of in the talk use these two really kind of seminal and super well-known essays, one by Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author, which obviously is really kind of attractive and provocative title, and you can imagine what stirred cause in 1977 when it was published, and kind of the kind of memorable sentence from that work is the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author, and which I will get to a little bit later, but just really want to point out the fact that the word author is written with a capital A, and that's kind of really crucial for this kind of Barthes killing, you know. And I feel sometimes people kind of stop reading the essay when they finish reading the title. They kind of, the death of the author, oh yeah, the author's dead, and they don't really care anymore what Barthes really wanted to say. And the other essay is Michel Foucault's essay, Who is an Author? And in that essay, he's kind of analyzing and trying to think a little bit more. What does it matter who is talking? He's kind of opening, or pretty much opening the essay with this question, which I think was first time used by Beckett actually. And he's kind of finishing the essay with the same sentence. And he doesn't really offer the kind of answer whether it matters or not, but he's kind of finishing with some sort of hope that one day it won't matter. And I will kind of use these two essays through my talk to kind of get clearer to the points I'm trying to make. So just to kind of explain the Barthes essay a little bit more. Barthes is really attacking the perception of the author with the capital A, which he kind of says replace the notion of the God in this sort of understanding of authority, of the ownership, of the only truth that's possible. And I have some few more quotes from that essay, that kind of, through which I would like to kind of illustrate it better, what the main point is, because he says, and now I quote, to give a text an author with capital A is to impose a limit on the text, to furnish it with a final signified to close the writing. But then also he kind of says that doesn't mean that the reader is kind of endlessly empowered and the author doesn't matter at all. Because he really kind of, realized that the total existence of writing, a text is made of multiple writing, drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relationships of dialogue, parody, contestation, but there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as was Herto said, the author. So this tries to say that the reader is kind of part of the same context as the author. So just within the reader, the kind of different texts and the knowledge is coming together, and the reader is making the sense, but he doesn't make the sense out of blue, but he's part of the culture, or he's part of a culture, of some social context, of some historical moment, and so the text makes meaning to him within that particular context. I think that's kind of really, really important to always think about reception and interpretation in connection with the word context, and to understand that that's basically what's framing this whole knowledge. And so I'm kind of, I know that like BART and this essay is often used in connection with social media and Web 2.0, and people kind of trying to demonstrate, oh look, the author really is dead, maybe finally. Look at things like Wikipedia, where basically there are multiple authors, and we can't really say who wrote it and who didn't, who are the kind of names and voices behind it, and basically this is the end of the notion of author as in a relation to ownership, responsibility of any sort of, like the kind of godlike point that the BART was trying to make. And then I would kind of argue, which is kind of in a line what Mark said before, we are starting to have more and more really the authors with the capital A again. And I don't know whether any of you ever heard of Andy Carvin, who is like very, very prominent kind of Twitter journalist. And as Mark was already saying, Andy Carvin himself call himself on his Twitter page DJ of the news. He kind of he works for American NPR, and his Twitter stream is basically used to aggregate, collect, some people say curate, news on particular topics. So he is usually very active in relation to kind of various crises, like or revolutions. He was very prominent in connection with Arab Spring, but also when there are like even like natural disasters, like for example the Katrina, oh God, I forgot the word now, the big wind, you know, in New Orleans. And so my point is that like we are getting more and more people that are being kind of branded, and they brand themselves. They kind of really trying to make their name, to stand out. With WikiLeaks, like WikiLeaks almost became synonym for Julian Assange. Like, and I don't know whether Jeff Jarvis is familiar to you. Like, he is kind of a prominent media blogger, and then when we look at these people, the interesting thing is how much they are kind of people talking, just the regular users talking, and how much they are actually part of the system. Because what we can get very often with these authors with capital A is that they suddenly being like in some form more or less appropriated by the institutionalized media. They are invited, either they eventually became members of them, which probably is not that much case of, let's say, American and, let's say, British context, but I'm coming from the Czech Republic, where the market is really small. So if somebody is prominent blogger and made their name as a blogger, they kind of stand out. Suddenly, within, I don't know, 6 months, you see that they join the staff of regular mainstream media. And then we are really entering the different questions. What is the integrity of these people, and what is their point, and do they really try to speak up, not necessarily against the media, but to present different voices that hasn't been represented by the mainstream media, or are they trying to kind of get there through some ways because they weren't able or willing or whatever to get there through the traditional ways? And how much is this kind of, I wouldn't say blurring between audiences and producers, but more like blurring between authors with small a and authors with capital A's. And where is the, like we're trying to kind of really figure out the relationship between how people now talk and how they have like bigger space and possibilities to become members of the kind of media produce, but somehow the people who are not known, how much their production makes sense or is valid, and the people who do talk and do become prominent, how much are they actually anymore just anybody talking? I would just like to little bit also hit on the terminology I'm using, just not to confuse you, because I sometimes feel that within the media we kind of using audiences as a term, but obviously this term is being now replaced by the word like users or customers, consumers, citizens, or they are traditional terms, these, but the new one is users or producers, and the older term is readers, while journalists are authors, but also journalists are producers, and sometimes the word is just even more general, the word media. And when we look at the kind of metaphor of the reader text and at the author in it, I kind of found myself, and maybe you might not agree with this at all, that the reader text author, kind of the very classical, the very, very old school kind of book reminding metaphor is the most useful one, because text is for me basically any object that you encounter and you have to somehow interpret. It's not only a question of text as a page with something. Sorry, that wasn't to entertain, that was just me being clumsy. Text to something be printed in, but basically we interpret the whole world around us, the kind of everyday. And to interpret means to read, and suddenly there is the author, the somebody who produced. And the author traditionally, or kind of etymologically, is coming from this notion of ownership and authority, and that basically there is somewhere behind, and we might not actually see that person, and we may never ever find out who the person is, but there is the message is, there is always a voice who has a reason why this message is being distributed and why this is being kind of said out loud. And so what I'm asking is, who is an author? But maybe even more, not who is an author, but what is an author? And I kind of created this little model to kind of link it back to the fact that, like Barth says, that the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. But somehow I feel that we are at the moment when we say the author is dead, long live the author. And I'm kind of wondering whether the birth of the author is being at the cost of the death of the reader. And so let me now kind of maybe go a little bit more to what is familiar to you, and that's the kind of, that's the topic of the authorship, of the authors, of the producers, of the media and journalists. And I found this really fascinating. I kind of found in a different book from 1982 this comment on this 13th century Franciscan monk San Bonaventura, who distinguished 4 different types of authors, or actually what he's talking about is 4 types of making books. And he distinguishes scripters, compilators, commentators, and what he called like auteur. And these functions, or these kind of roles, basically are described there. Like the scripter is the one who copies the text, the compilator is the one who kind of copies but adds bits and bobs but never writes his own, and commentator is somebody who takes different texts together and kind of oh sorry, the other way around. The compilator puts the other text together but never adds his own, and the commentator is just adding his little comments. And then the last position is somebody who puts their words in the center and might just use other text, kind of comments on his own. And when I started to think about that, I was just like, well, how did the way we see production change since the 13th century? And I couldn't really figure out that there would be any other form of producing a text that wouldn't be like kind of represented in this kind of very, very old categorization. And and I've been really interested in how kind of authorship or media kind of producers are being conceptualized. And I find very interesting also another kind of more recent categories, which is quite famous, Ervin Goffman's book on where he offers multi-layered concept of media producers, and in his categories are derived from the author's relation. And he very, I think, importantly distinguishes between animator, who is somebody who speaks. That's like, let's say, a television presenter. That's basically, if we say it very vulgarly, that's the talking head. Then he distinguishes author, who is the one who selects what is being said. And then the principle, that for Goffman is basically that's the voice behind, the somebody who beliefs are being told, somebody who has the benefits from what is being told, somebody who is pushing the message through the system. And what my whole kind of talk is trying to suggest is that we should start to think about authors not in very limited dimensions, as is the mention, how is something produced, or what is the relationship to message, or whether the producers are professional or amateurs, collective or individual, but we should kind of start to think about authors, producers in much more kind of multidimensional sense. And we should start to see that the aspects of authors or producers we can look at are really, really kind of broad. And kind of try to, this is my form of theoretical analysis of what are the characteristics that might be relevant and kind of grouping them into 4 dimensions. I definitely don't claim that this is exhausted kind of categorization, and you might, I'm sure you will come up with some kind of other things that are not represented in the table. But what this table tries to more shows is that there are various things that, even if we divide them into dimensions, what's also important that these dimensions should never ever be understood as kind of exclusive or kind of contradictory. They can be combined together, and we can kind of come up with different crossings where these dimensions meet, and they kind of creating identities or kind of characteristic of authors that might be relevant for particular context, but completely irrelevant for different one. And it's really important to start to think about the authors. I mean, it is very important to think about the authors the way it's being done, and you will kind of hear at this conference more. But coming from the audience perspective, I really felt that there's somewhere there is missing very important aspect, and that's how the audiences see the authors. Who are the authors for the audiences? How do they perceive them? How do they understand them? And how do they interpret them? How do they work with it? We kind of always say, oh, there is a citizen journalist versus professional institutionalized journalist. But that's our theoretical categorization. That's how we kind of, from the position of, let's say, journalism or media theory, talk about them. But how do the audiences talk about them? And this is kind of the way where I think the traditional audience research may kind of make the mistake, or not mistake, but where's the weakest point of the traditional audience research, and that's because the author became redundant, because the main relationship is between the text and the reader, and the author was not kind of recognized and acknowledged at all. We kind of disregard something that I feel is actually really important, and not necessarily because we should be seeking what's the author's intention, but more because the author is part of our culture. The author, or the notion of the author, the notion of the authorial presence, is part of the culture and social and historical context within which we do use and consume media, and therefore we should care who are the people who produce the meaning. I just kind of summarized the approach to the authors within the audience research up to now, and this kind of Mark talks a lot about the blurring distinction between the production and consumption, but you have also other authors who are kind of interested in other aspects of audiences becoming journalists or producers. Kind of quite interesting recently, the work of exactly what I've been talking about a little bit earlier, this kind of amateur versus professional status, and how some journalists kind of trying to become professional, but also there are some journalists, especially in the case of, let's say, war reporting, which is David Parks or Melissa Wall's work, where they kind of talking that people don't want to be seen as professional. They kind of purposefully trying to distinguish themselves from the professional mainstream because they are some voice from outside. And so my question is, how do the readers perceive, articulate, and understand the authors? And as I already hinted, like I am coming from the philosophical hermeneutics tradition, and I don't want to burden you with some kind of really big philosophical thoughts, but I find Hans-Georg Gadamer really, really useful, and his theory says something really interesting. He says, like, understanding is always interpretation, and hence interpretation is the explicit form of understanding, and that's basically what I said already at the beginning. We do just interpret everything that is happening to us. Our understanding of it will be always slightly different than the person who is next to us. What's also really important about Gadamer's approach, and maybe you will start to see me very relativistic, but he uses these three concepts, which is tradition, prejudice, and horizon. I will just very briefly explain to you what do they mean. Like, we all are coming from some tradition, which is a term that you shouldn't understand too conservatively. It just basically means we are born into some context, and whatever we try to do, we can never ever kind of leave it. We can oppose it, we can go against it, but we always do within. That's kind of where we are. So even though we are moving forward, there is still some sort of reference framework that we've been kind of given by the fact where we were born, to whom we were born, what is going around us, how the things were explained to us, defined for us, and what is the starting point from which we do any other thinking after. And prejudice should be understood kind of more like a prior knowledge. So in a situation we are in, any moment of interpretation, we always enter within kind of the prior knowledge. So talking about new media, let's kind of make a little parallel. Any new media we encounter, we will always use the framework of the old media we have somehow inside of us. So if I show you gadget and the gadget will have a screen, your first reference point probably will be television, maybe not yours anymore, that would be mine, but yours probably would be maybe telephone screen, I don't know, but there is always, you always understand new things through the old things. You kind of trying to kind of familiarize with the thing you are seeing through the things you already know, and through that kind of meeting and learning the things you do not know, but you somehow have to make it understandable to you. And the tradition and prejudice are creating horizon, and so basically horizon is the thing we carry with us, the horizon is the thing we are encountering everything, and what's very, very important for understanding horizons, but also this whole theory, is that the horizon is continuously changing. So you should really think about this theoretical approach as kind of like an ontological process of change. So every new encounter is changing the old position of yours. So there is kind of change, and things do progress, and it is not conservative and rigid and stable. And that's where I think this is very useful in kind of thinking about whatever, but in my case about authors, that like we should be kind of, we should understand authors as some sort of things that is changing the concept or the way how we as a, not only academic scholars, but as a ordinary people using media every day, the way how we perceive what author is, who authors are, is kind of changing, because we are like the understanding, the new ways that we are meeting are changing our understanding, equally, it doesn't mean it's changing abruptly. The change is never like, now, this was before and this is now. But it is the continuity, this kind of very slow process, almost like unnoticed, is what's really, really important. I will kind of skip this long quote. It's just a quote that is trying to explain how the author is understood within the Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics, because obviously Gadamer is saying that the author is not important, so I'm kind of doing something very heretic within philosophical hermeneutics, bringing the author back. But I want to kind of use this framework of philosophical hermeneutics to kind of outline what is important for me and where I'm coming from, and that is the encounter between the text and the reader. So if you talk about authors, theoretically, you can have author as a function, which is the Foucault's essay that he talks about. But this author is inscribed in the text. This author is helping us to position the text within some particular historical context. This author function is also kind of helping us to create some kind of cultural context, what text means, what good author means, what good text means. And so it's not really a useful concept for audiences. But so I kind of dare to suggest my own concept, and that's something I call imagine author. Because within the literary theory, they work with a concept that's called implied reader, because as I said at the beginning, they don't work with empirical reader. They have something that's called implied reader. But this implied reader doesn't belong to the text, which is, for example, Model's reader that Umberto Eco works with. That's a reader that belongs to the text. That's the kind of the reader that's inscribed in the text to be the ideal reader. This is how the reader, if he would kind of be fully aware of all the things that the author was aware, that's how he would interpret it. But the implied reader has the advantage of being this dialectical position. The implied reader is inside of the text, but also outside, or neither. That depends how you look at it. He's sort of empirical, he's contextualized, but he's also kind of determined by the text. And I didn't use the term implied author because that's been already used and means something slightly different. Implied author is actually author that's inscribed in the text. And so I am using the term imagine author. And this imagine author, for me, is this very, very dialectical concept. Something that's like endlessly changing, and something that kind of is a part of a circle. You can't really break the circle anyway. You know that I didn't really like represent it in a form of circle, but I think it still kind of makes sense. So the imagine author is a result of the encounter between the text and the reader. But the reader is entering the encounter with some already existing articulation of what an author is, or what he expects the author to be. That's the prejudice. But equally the text is kind of through the interpretation, through the reader's interpretation, informing the reader's knowledge or kind of understanding who that author is, because the text does suggest who the author was. So the imagine author is actually, we do not care who the real author is, whether it's John Smith and whether he had a blonde hair and whether he was writing it in his living room or in a newsroom. But when we read it, when we read any text, we do kind of looking for some hints, for some signs that will help us to identify who the person is, or more like who's the voice that is talking, and whether we do agree with that voice, and whether we do identify it with that person. And very, very good example, I was doing research with young people in their mid-20s, and it was really interesting to talk to people and see how, when they are buying new products, and making decisions or deciding whether they will go to see some concert or what's the new music they should be listening to or what's the new game they should be playing. They always, obviously these days, use other users' comments or other people's comments, and they have this kind of way of talking about the comments in a way, oh, this guy, you know, like he liked that game, and that means that and that and that, and that means like I wouldn't like the new one because I disagree with him. And in the Czech Republic there is this website, something like IMDb, the film database, but kind of like Czech-based and produced by Czech users. It is actually really interesting because the authors are predominantly the users, and you have to have an account to be able to kind of write, but the people not only comment, but they create profiles of actors and directors, and but to be able to become member, and more importantly to be allowed to produce, you have to pass a test. They kind of give you some questions, and you have to pass kind of knowledge of film, like you have to prove some sort of expertise to be allowed to write. So the community is sort of self-regulating. They're kind of looking who the other people are and whether they will allow them to contribute, but they don't care what your name is or what's your like identity. And so I kind of argue that the way how people, or like the question of who the author is also important to kind of understand how do people navigate themselves through the web of information that is available to them. And I kind of argue that in the current media environment, who is talking probably matters more than when Foucault wrote his essay. And the kind of characteristic of an author that are very, very important are something that I name continuity, persistence, reputation, and expertise. So continuity and persistence are kind of link also a little bit to something we can call identity. So people don't care whether the name you are using is real, but they kind of trying to see that when they are reading something under the same handle name, the person is that's the same person, that the same person is talking, and that there is this kind of continuity, that there is some kind of identity they can kind of relate to, and that the people are persistent, not necessarily that they can't change their opinion, but that they are persistent in the way they're talking about stuff, and that they can kind of trust that that identity is not being corrupted by some sort of like I don't know, various authors. The reputation is more external kind of context. Reputation is something that you're looking how other people talk about the person you are trying to follow or you are trying to trust. So you're kind of looking for more like intertextual context. You're kind of reading other texts to see what other people say. And, oh sorry, I put expectation. It's supposed to be expertise. This is, completely, I don't know, my blindness. Expertise is something that you are judging the person's comments, and you are trying to evaluate where their knowledge is and how you kind of going to work with it. And I kind of create this little distinction between sources and authors that serve as a filters and gates. And the filters are sources and authors that kind of narrow down the amount of information, and the users use them to kind of find the things that they are relevant to them, while gates are kind of opening. At the same time, obviously, like filter is in a way also gate, because obviously the filter is narrowing you something so you can find out new information. And equally gates are somehow filtering because they are opening the spectrum for you, but they also are in a way filtering within which kind of interest area you will find those information. But I think this kind of really work well in, I mean, not exclusively, but when I was thinking about it in a case of like Twitter, where when you are following different accounts, they do have different purpose for you. Some people you are following because they are expert on very particular topics, and they kind of filtering the information for you. Other accounts you are following because whatever they say is interesting, even though it might not be kind of necessarily, or precisely for the reason because it's not necessarily where you do feel strongly about. Kind of feel like I'm a little bit running out of the time, but I have just this kind of last little bit like my little anecdote. And don't know whether you ever heard about the blogger Gay Girl in Damascus. It's from 2011. Which was quite famous case of like false identity. And something kind of similar, and I put these two things together, is something that happened in the Czech Republic. So let me maybe talk about that, because that's probably harder for you to kind of source. There's been this book published, which is called White Horse and Yellow Dragon by this Vietnamese girl. Or she entered competition with her manuscript, competition by a really big publishing house, and the prize for the competition was that the person who will win will be published. And there was an anonymous jury, and she won. And she was supposed to attend the event, and she said, no, I can't attend it. I'm in Vietnam because I think her family was ill or something like that. And she sent a video on which she says, oh, thank you very much for this prize, blah, blah, blah. And the book was published. And eventually, it started to leak out and then became quite big story that the book was actually written by the man who is on the picture with the Vietnamese girl. And he used this pseudonym, and he kind of pretended that he's this Vietnamese girl. He actually knows personally the Vietnamese girl, and that's why the video existed, because he just asked kind of this friend of his to do the video for him. Why it's interesting is that there's quite a big Vietnamese community within the Czech Republic, but this Vietnamese community is kind of not really active in some kind of national, on a national level, obviously, culture production. So there's definitely very, very lively kind of culture production of the Vietnamese people within their community. But the Czechs are not really familiar with that, or probably don't even allow these people to enter the kind of spaces of the Czechness, you know. So this book created really kind of big debate that, like, finally we have a book that's written by a Czech Vietnamese and kind of show us how these people perceive the community or the whole society. And when they found out that it was written by a white middle-aged man, people are really disappointed. And basically the book's being called like, it's not good quality, the book is not good at all, the publishing house said, oh, it's been fraud, we want the prize back. And the question is, like, pseudonyms are not anything new. People used to write under the pseudonyms since ever, not only using different names or using different genders, like ethnicities. And I was kind of thinking why people are being so kind of touched by the fact that the person they were expecting is not the person that it is. It's even more obvious in the case of the gay girl in Damascus, because it's indeed, again, a person that was female, gay, living in Damascus. She was supposed to be half Syrian, half American, and eventually went missing, and kind of quite a big international movement raised to kind of try to free her, because people saw that she's been arrested. And after quite big debates on the internet, people started to then there was her real picture, or like her picture being published, for example, on the cover of Guardian, and it's been kind of found out that the picture's been stolen from the internet, and then the person who is on the picture is originally from, I think, Serbia, and the girl's been really kind of attacked by the fact that somebody stole her identity and used it for different purposes. And by that, people started to actually search who the real Amina, who the real gay girl in Damascus is. And eventually it's been revealed that it's this kind of American guy who at that point lived in Edinburgh, called Tom McCarthy. And what's really interesting is, and there is quite a long video if you are interested in BBC archive. You can find it, but I have this little transcript that when it was revealed that the girl who was on the pictures is actually not the real girl, Jeremy Paxman, quite famous British journalist, invited the girl, but also the Syrian human rights activist, into this kind of news program called Newsnight. And at one point he asked the guy, saying like, it can be man, and it can be even a group of people. And the guy says, yeah, but it doesn't matter who you really are, because what matters is that if you're a critical cyber activist, operating within the borders of the secret state, what matters is your alter ego character. And we don't even know if she even exists. What matters is that in that kind of activities, in that kind of work, is your character, alter ego, and she created that without having to use a picture. And he is suggesting that what matters is the message that you kind of distributing, and not who you are, because the message, and it's important, and later in the interview he really says there's no doubt that the person really knows the environment, that the person kind of knows Syria, the situation now, the position of gay people there, the dangers the person is. And suddenly where the real identity was revealed, and it was revealed as like American person, white man, so kind of basically didn't tick any of the identity boxes. People were really, really hurt, and there was loads of disappointment and kind of this massive feeling of betray. And I kind of realized that they are really some sort of expectations we put into the authors, how we read them, and that the messages make particular sense because particular people are saying them. So it actually didn't really matter. It wasn't really true what the guy said, because it did really matter who is it saying it. When something that was obviously very important was being said by somebody else, suddenly didn't have the same meaning when it was being said by somebody else than people were hoping for originally. So just kind of really quickly to conclude, what I'm trying to say is that the authorial presence is still a very vital aspect of the reception, and it is really important, and maybe more than ever we should be looking into who is talking, and it should matter to us, but not necessarily to uncover the real meaning and whether the people are kind of trying to brainwash us or not, but more to see how readers, audiences work with the messages, because if we all are becoming authors, we should be worried whether there are any readers left. Okay, we are all producing, we are kind of uploading and taking pictures and blogging, but who is reading? I kind of feel that like not every reader is an author, but every author is a reader, but also equally, not everything that is being produced is read, listened to, or watched. So kind of, we should maybe sometimes steps a little bit down from the kind of over-celebration of the fact that we all can produce something, and start to look into whether the fact that we do produce actually makes any meaning, and people make any meanings out of it, and how do they understand that. So, thank you very much.